You wake before dawn to a house that seems quieter than it should be, the kind of quiet that presses against the ribs. The alarm is gentle, the weight is not. On the kitchen table, a stack of envelopes fans out like evidence, a mortgage notice, an electricity bill, the letter you can't bring yourself to open. You run your thumb along the crease of a photograph stuck between bills, a child laughing, a partner asleep on the couch after a late shift. For a moment you taste the strange mix of coffee and fear. Is this it? You whisper to the ceiling. Did God forget my plan? Outside, morning light filigrees through blinds, indifferent and patient. Inside, the worry is closer, personal. You rehearse the dates, the promises you made, the sacrifices you were sure would pay off. The future you imagine doesn't match the spreadsheet on your phone. Somewhere between the dreams and the deadlines, you feel the squeeze of responsibility tightening, parents to care for, a career that no longer thrills, questions about risk and safety that refuse to be ignored. The voice inside swings between anger and pleading. Work harder, it says. Hide, it says. Both feel insufficient. Then, without fanfare, a message arrives. Not a lightning bolt or a booming pronouncement, but a simple text from someone who once believed in you. Start with what you have. Name one small step today. Or a line from an old sermon you barely remember. Fear is a teacher if you let it teach. It lands like a pebble dropped into the bowl of your mind, ripples, not fireworks. You find yourself listening differently, like a tired soldier finally noticing the cadence of the drum that will guide a march. You fold the bills back into their envelope and make a single, practical choice: call to reschedule the payment, make one cost cut, set aside $30 for an emergency. It feels small and holy all at once. The crisis hasn't dissolved, the dread remains. But the shift has occurred, fear has stopped being a sentence and begun to sound like instruction. If this early morning truth touches you, stay with this story, there is a path forward. Like this moment if it resonates, subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next steps. In the next scene you will learn how scarcity becomes a teacher and how small acts of stewardship become spiritual practice. You sit at the kitchen table under the thin light of the lamp, a stack of envelopes like small white mountains. Rain threads the window. The note you read this morning, that quiet nudge, is still warm in your mind, not a promise of riches, but a clear instruction: begin. You fold the first letter open, breathe, and begin to itemize. The act of naming each debt, each deadline, turns a roaring storm into measurable steps. It does not erase fear, but it converts it into a plan. A week later you meet a counselor in a neighborhood cafe, a woman with steady eyes who speaks like scripture and spreadsheets at once. She makes no grand vows, she asks questions. What is the smallest thing you can change today that frees space next month, she asks. You answer haltingly, then more firmly: cancel one subscription, learn 3 ways to cut grocery costs, call the utilities company. Her smile is not pity, it is expectation. Scarcity trains a muscle, she says, stirring her coffee. It asks you to practice courage and clarity. The way she folds the paper napkin into a list makes it seem possible. You begin to practice small rituals. Each payday you pay yourself first, even if it's $5 into a savings envelope named emergency. You track every cup of coffee, every impulse. Stewardship becomes prayer. You say a brief word of gratitude before transferring money, asking for wisdom, not rescue. You choose one modest act of generosity: a neighbor's child invited to dinner, a small tip for the barista, because generosity rewires your sense of lack into belonging. Some nights you wake with the old dread. Sometimes you stumble and overdraw. But the discipline compounds. The envelope that held your lunch money now holds the seed of a small investment idea. The call you avoided becomes a negotiation that lowers a bill. You learn to read the signs, the opportunities disguised as hardships, and to treat fear as instruction rather than verdict. If this resonates, like it to send this message forward, stay with me and you'll learn the 3 practical shifts that change crisis into training. Subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next step, when the real test arrives and your habits are pushed to the edge. You wake before dawn again, the house quiet except for the soft tick of a clock and the rustle of bills on the kitchen table. Light from the street lamp cuts a thin rectangle across the floor. You sit, coffee gone cold, and trace the numbers with the tip of a finger as if that alone could change them. A small, clear voice, half your faith, half your fear, asks, "What will you do next?" It is not cosmic thunder that answers, but a gentle practicality: start small, start honest. Across the next weeks you become an apprentice to living intentionally. You keep receipts in a shoebox and name them aloud: rent, groceries, school. You tell your partner the truth about choices you feared naming. You walk to work on a rainy day to save the bus fare, and feel a quiet steadiness grow with each saved dollar. In a cramped evening conversation, your older cousin, who has seen storms and sunny spells, says, "God's not taking your dream, He's teaching you how to steward it." The words land like a blueprint. Scarcity stops being an enemy and becomes a trainer. It tightens your focus until old, scattered habits are visible: impulse purchases, avoidance, pride. You learn to measure risk like a craftsperson testing tools: what can be repaired, what yields, what must be left. Generosity, once an afterthought, becomes a discipline. You give a small amount to the food pantry and find your hands less clenched, your fear less absolute. Each small act is a prayer: pay a bill, say no to a needless charge, offer a compassionate refund at your side job, and each act reshapes your confidence. The voice of faith, sometimes a pastor's counsel, sometimes a quiet line in your journal, doesn't promise instant abundance. It offers rules of the road: honesty with money, courage to risk wisely, humility to learn. There are nights of doubt, arguments at the kitchen table, and days when the ledger refuses to bend. But even in those tests you find lessons: persistence, boundaries, and the willingness to pivot. If this resonates, stay with the path. I will show you how to convert humble practices into a plan that sustains soul and pocket alike. Like this truth if it lands with you, subscribe and ring the bell to walk the next steps together, where your crisis becomes the training ground for lasting prosperity. You sit at the kitchen table again, the lamp throwing a small island of light over a sea of envelopes. Outside, the street is quiet, but inside your head a louder weather of what-ifs and should-have swirls. You reach for a pen and, almost without thinking, begin to list what you own and what you owe. The numbers are honest and stubborn. The first lesson arrives not as revelation but as a slow, patient voice: start where you are. It feels like a hand on your shoulder, steady, not smug. The next mornings become a ritual. You wake earlier, brew coffee, open your laptop, and begin to learn the language of money the way you might learn a new craft. There are late-night tutorials, a battered notebook full of rules you translate into life: separate needs from wants, build a small cushion, track every cent for 30 days. Each rule is a repetition of faith, small acts repeated until they reshape you. You find yourself smiling at the discipline of it, surprised by how clear choices become when named. A friend, someone who has walked through similar hunger, invites you to coffee. Think like a steward, they say, stirring their mug. You don't need to be reckless with hope. You need to be honest with what you have. You mimic their cadence, practice saying the words aloud in the mirror until they stop sounding like advice and start sounding like a plan. You begin to give again in tiny ways: a few dollars at the food bank, an hour teaching a neighbor to budget. Generosity feels strange at first, then like putting a necessary gear back into a machine that had been stuck. On a rainy afternoon you stand in a small room filled with used books and faith posters. A counselor, soft-spoken, exact, lays out a simple map: emergency fund, debt repayment, small investment. Scarcity trains you, she says, but it doesn't have to teach you fear. Her voice threads theory and prayer into practice, asking you to test reasonable risks and to measure outcomes, not emotions. You learn to read signs: a pattern of overspending, a season where extra work is possible, a talent that could be monetized, and to act with both courage and restraint. The crisis that once felt like a trap is changing into a gym where you are being trained. You are growing muscles you didn't know you had: patience, foresight, surrender. And as discipline settles into habit, a new question forms, less about escaping hardship and more about stewarding possibility. What will you do with this training when the real test comes? The morning light slips through the blinds like a question. You sit at the kitchen table with a stack of envelopes and the thin hospital mug you've kept because it still fits your hand right. The numbers on the paper feel heavier than they should. Then you hear it, not thunder, but a steady, small voice that has begun to sound less like accident and more like instruction. Start here, it says, pointing at the smallest, unremarkable thing, a monthly subscription you never used, the second streaming account, the extra coffee runs. It is not a command so much as a lens. You breathe, tally, and realize stewardship is a craft you can learn. Days fold into a new rhythm. You meet with a counselor, someone who has walked through winters and remembers the exact weight of doubt. He teaches you to read signs, interest rates that lift like tides, a neighbor's sudden offer to barter for childcare, the pattern in your own spending that appears at the same time every month. Scarcity isn't your enemy, he says, it's your trainer. It asks for discipline, courage, attention. You practice tiny acts, scheduling bills like appointments, building a truth envelope where a fixed portion is set aside before the rest is touched, saying no to instant gratification, and watch your inner skepticism soften. There are resistances. At night you imagine a headline, "You lost everything by being careful." The voice answers in a softer register, "Wise risk is not reckless escape." You learn what it means to bet on yourself without gambling your family's safety. You repair a skill you'd abandoned, take a short course, draft a service you can offer. You make a small loan to a friend who needs seed money for a project, and the gratitude they return transforms into an unexpected client referral. Generosity, done with boundaries, becomes a compass, not a leak. The crisis sharpens habits into routines. Prayer turns into practical pauses before decisions. Fasting becomes a discipline of spending, pausing before purchase to ask if this aligns with the life you're building. Each season of restraint crafts an inner confidence that is quieter than excitement but steadier. And just when the new habits feel like armor, a choice arrives on your phone and at your table, an invitation to step up in a way that will test everything you've learned. You wake before dawn again, the kitchen light haloing the stack of overdue notices like small judgments. The coffee cools while your hand traces a budget on a napkin, numbers that feel both intimate and unforgiving. A soft voice from the night returns, not booming, but practical, "Start where you are. Do what you can." It becomes a rhythm. You learn to read the signs, a cheaper route home that saves gas, an extra hour after work that turns into a freelance client, a book recommendation from a neighbor that reframes risk as education. Inside this apprenticeship, scarcity ceases to be an enemy and becomes the trainer at your shoulder. When the car dies on a rainy morning, you feel the sting, but you also discover resourcefulness, calling an old friend who knows mechanics, arranging a carpool, trading a skill for a ride. Scarcity teaches you discipline, envelopes get labeled, subscriptions are cut, meals are planned. Those acts feel mundane until you see them through the lens of faith, every disciplined choice a prayer in motion. Be faithful with little, the quiet counsel reminds you, and you begin to treat stewardship as devotion. Generosity surprises you. Giving a small portion to someone worse off is not loss but a recalibration, it trains your heart away from hoarding. You find courage to take wise risks, a night class, a small investment in a trusted venture, negotiating a raise with facts and calm. Each choice is tested, some fail, some land, and each failure becomes material for the next, teaching humility and honest accounting of impulses. There are scenes that cut through the monotony, a late-night spreadsheet beside a sleeping household, a mentor's call that says, "What's one concrete step you can act on today?" A trembling yes when you decide to ask for help. You begin to notice patterns, delayed payments that force conversations, thank you notes that build networks, daily routines that compound into margin. Faith and finance stop being separate tracks, they braid into practical wisdom that honors purpose. I promise that the next part will show how those steady habits start to turn into momentum, how small, faithful choices tip a season. If this landed with you, give it a like from the heart, subscribe, and tap the bell so we keep walking this path together. In the next episode, you'll meet the first real signs that steady work is becoming sustainable prosperity. The morning light slips through the blinds and slats, painting the kitchen table where unopened bills lie like small, honest weights. You cradle a mug, steam fogging the rim of your glasses, and count in your head the ways today could go wrong. Then you remember the quiet nudge, the line of scripture, the mentor's phrase, the late-night whisper that turned fear into instruction. Begin where you are, it said. So you begin, you open a spreadsheet, not as punishment but as a map. You learn to name things. Not just debt but each creditor, each recurring expense, each habit that eats savings like termites. You sit beside a friend at a worn cafe, she speaks low, practical. Pay the smallest balance first, she says, stirring sugar with a steady hand. Then celebrate each closed account. The celebration is small, a dinner from a saved coupon, a walk in the park, but it reprograms your appetite for instant comfort. The scarcity that once swallowed your courage becomes a trainer, issuing daily drills: track, say no, choose generosity instead of hoarding. There are tougher lessons. An unexpected car repair arrives like a storm, the temptation to panic is immediate. You breathe and ask the same counsel you practiced: what is faithful stewardship here? You negotiate with the mechanic, offer overtime at work, and ask a neighbor for a ride. You give away a little, too, a handful of rice and a quiet blessing to a single mother waiting on the stoop, because the voice inside reminds you that faith tested by action is faith that grows. Conversations with a trusted pastor, a financial coach, your own inner counsel become rehearsal rooms for wisdom. Risk, one says, isn't gambling, it's informed movement toward purpose. So you place a modest bet on a skill you can monetize: teaching, fixing, advising, while maintaining discipline in the rest of your life. Discipline, it turns out, feels like freedom when it is practiced daily. In these months, habits become rituals: paying tithe with gratitude, building an emergency fund, saying no to the shiny lure that promises quick relief. The crisis does not ease overnight, but each deliberate act reshapes the story. If this steady work resonates, like this moment, subscribe and tap the bell to walk the rest of the path with me. Next, you will meet the turning point when small, faithful decisions begin to compound into real, sustainable prosperity. Dawn finds you at the same kitchen table, light slanting through blinds, bills like pale confessions on the wood. You cradle a cup of coffee that no longer warms as it once did. The old voice returns, practical, hungry: play it safe, wait for security. Across from it, the quieter voice you've been learning to trust speaks with the steadiness of someone who's seen small things ripen: start where you are. One clear step. You hear your own hesitation and then, unexpectedly, a remembered phrase from that still, small nudge: stewardship first, fear second. You call the credit counselor you found last month. Her voice is plain and unadorned: show me the numbers. Tell me your commitments. You lay them out: rent, school fees, that loan you keep promising to refinance, and she asks the kind of question no panic would: what's one expense you can turn into an investment? The question lands like a seed. In the silence, you name a choice you'd been avoiding: invest in a short course that sharpens a skill you can sell. It costs 2 weeks' worth of takeout, but it promises competency, confidence, and a product you can bring to market. That afternoon you walk into a community workspace, the air full of other people's beginnings. A woman introduces herself and hands you a business card the way people hand hope, without drama, as if it's a tool. We collaborate, she says. We split risks. It's not a miracle, it's a covenant of small obligations. You offer to test a service for a neighbor, negotiate payment terms that honor both scarcity and value, and for the first time in months, a client says yes. The first payment is modest. It doesn't erase the stack of bills, but it does something subtler: it answers the ancient question you've been asking God: do you still care? With evidence that you are being entrusted again, bit by measurable bit. In this chapter, scarcity stops being an enemy and becomes the trainer that refines your muscle of discipline. Stewardship looks like spreadsheets, generosity looks like paying a local supplier early because gratitude earns trust, and faith looks like choosing a disciplined plan over a panic-driven shortcut. If you want the specific daily practices, prayers, and negotiation scripts that turn those timid beginnings into repeatable momentum, I'll share them next. If this moment touched you, press like, let it be an emotional yes to courage. Subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next scene, where one hard, honest decision begins to change everything. Morning light comes in a different way now, soft, intentional, as if the house itself has learned to breathe. You sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, the stack of envelopes no longer a blade at your chest but a ledger to be met with clarity. The numbers are still there, but so is a map, small, steady choices translated into outcomes. You remember the quiet nudge that changed everything, no lightning bolt, only a voice that taught you to look, to reckon, to act. That voice became a tutor for habits. Outside, a neighbor waves while unloading tools. Inside, your partner slides a repaired toy across the table for your child. We did the list, they say, voice steady. We closed one more leak. That one sentence, practical, humble, lands like scripture. You learn that stewardship is less about grand gestures and more about fidelity to the small things. Paying a bill on time, setting aside a predictable percentage, saying no to a tempting but reckless purchase, these are prayers turned into practice. You meet with a counselor who leans forward, not with judgment but with a ledger and a plan. Risk is a muscle, they say. Strengthen it with knowledge. You test that muscle, a modest investment after research, a conversation with a client that becomes a steady contract, a side skill sharpened into offer. Each success is not fireworks but a new rhythm. The fear that once anchored you loosens as courage is exercised and proven. Generosity surprises you. Giving becomes less of a ledger subtraction and more of a line that opens a door. A small loan to a friend turns into shared work, a donation to a local shelter returns as connections and reputation. Prosperity begins to look like an irrigation system, water flows where intention and action create channels. You sleep differently. You rise with homework instead of dread, an accountability notebook, a monthly check-in, a family meeting to name priorities and faith. There are setbacks, contract delays, a repair that costs more than expected, but they no longer define the arc. They refine it. You read the signs, adjust, and move. In living rooms, at small tables, in quiet prayers, the divine guidance you once doubted becomes audible in choices that compound. If this scene resonates, if you can see your next step in these small, steady acts, like this moment with an honest heart and subscribe to follow the rest of the journey, ring the bell so when we unpack how these habits become legacy, you'll be there to continue the work. You sit at the kitchen table again, the cheap lamp throwing a warm pool of light over crumpled envelopes and a laptop screen that refuses to sleep. Rain hisses against the window like a metronome counting out patience. For a long moment you listen to the quiet, no heavenly trumpet, only the small, persistent voice that has been your tutor. Steward what you have. Learn on the margin. Give even when it hurts. You remember the first time you did it, slipping $5 into an urgent mailbox for a neighbor. Your hands trembled, but a strange relief followed, as if something had been set right inside you. Tonight you practice what you have been taught. You make the spreadsheet not as punishment but as liturgy, income, obligations, allowances, and a line for generosity. The numbers are not miraculous, but they reveal options you hadn't seen, where a tiny cut yields seed money, where a delayed payment buys time to prepare a better offer. You craft a short proposal for a client into the quiet hours, each sentence an honest prayer, clear, honest, valuable. When you hit send, you feel both faith and discipline in your chest. A text arrives from a mentor, courage is an earned muscle. Keep training. You laugh softly and return to the ledger, deciding to set aside a small emergency fund tonight. It is not a rescue plan, it is training for resilience. You imagine scarcity not as enemy but as a sparring partner. It bruises, it teaches footwork, it builds your guard. In the neighbor's house down the hall, a violin lifts, imperfect and steady, and you are reminded that beauty often begins in practice. You begin to notice patterns, the way your patience steadies conversations, how clear boundaries attract different opportunities. A client calls back, not to haggle, but to accept the proposal because you were honest about value and timing. The small victory tastes like the first cup of coffee after days of sleeplessness, warm, grounding, and promising more. If this moment felt like your own, promise yourself one thing: keep training. If this story gave you courage, Tap like to honor that step, subscribe and ring the bell. Next, we step into the season where those disciplined choices become a steady harvest. You stand in the kitchen again, but the light is different now, soft, patient, as if it waited for you to finally notice. The same stack of envelopes, the same calendar with its small, blunt numbers, but something in you has shifted. You remember the night you knelt by the bed, palms raw from worry, whispering the question that had haunted you for months, "Have you forgotten me?" The answer came not as thunder but as a steady hand on your shoulder, "I haven't forgotten your dreams, I'm training you for them." That training looked nothing like a fast lane to riches. It looked like steady mornings, a carefully kept ledger, a conversation with a mentor who asked the hard questions you'd been avoiding. It sounded like long walks when panic knocked, small acts of generosity when your account screamed scarcity, and the quiet discipline of saying no to ease in favor of future freedom. You practiced stewardship as prayer, every budget line became a promise kept to yourself, every disciplined choice a step toward integrity. There were days you stumbled, decisions that felt like setbacks, but each failure taught a grammar of resilience. Treat scarcity as your teacher, a trusted voice said, and you did. You learned to read the signs, an opportunity disguised as risk, a relationship that needed boundary, a talent waiting for practice. In the long, honest work of living small truths, your character grew into capacity. Prosperity arrived not as a banner but as rhythm, consistent income, enough margin to breathe, the joy of giving without fear. Picture yourself now, paying bills with calm hands, making plans with a steady heart, speaking kindly to the younger you who thought God had vanished. You have become both steward and dreamer, rooted in purpose and equipped with habits that carry you forward. This is not the end of struggle, but the end of being defeated by it. If this message touched you, like it, an act of hope, and subscribe so we can keep walking this path together. Hit the bell and you'll receive practical teachings and quiet, wise counsel to help turn your crisis into training. Which crisis are you living today, and what will you do tomorrow? The next step waits.